What the officials signed on paper crossed a threshold that commanders on the ground had hoped would hold, and when that threshold broke, quietly, without fanfare, without any press release, the soldiers didn't hesitate. They kept fighting with discipline, with caution, and with the full knowledge that the world was being told a completely different story. For weeks now, there had been signals, not from official briefings, not from diplomatic cables, just signals that the ceasefire being negotiated at the highest levels was being built on a foundation that neither side had actually agreed to. Both parties to this conflict have been willing to talk, yes, but they have been deeply, stubbornly committed to their original objectives in their willingness to talk. Their moves have followed a certain rhythm, a cadence, almost a predictability. But what set off alarm bells among field commanders and independent conflict monitors this week was that the rhythm didn't stop when the ink dried. Analysts who monitor active conflict zones know the indicators. The repositioning of forward units away from civilian lines, the drawdown of artillery systems from contested ridge lines, the reduction of nighttime patrol frequency in disputed corridors, the sudden silence of tactical radio communications between frontline squads. None of that happened. And whenever troops on the ground don't change their behavior after a ceasefire is announced, it means the ceasefire exists in one world and the war exists in another. Early this week, independent conflict monitors detected what they described as continued tactical movement patterns on both sides, including supply line reinforcement and the repositioning of mortar units that had not been withdrawn in over 10 days since the announcement. These are the kinds of movements that military forces only sustain when they are signaling something very specific, that they expect contact, that they are preparing for escalation, or that they were never told to stop. Observers on the ground didn't know which category this fell into, or whether it fell into all three at once. But what they did know was that both sets of forces were maintaining a war posture. And when organized military forces maintain a war posture without explanation, even after a ceasefire is announced, the people who bear the cost are not the diplomats who signed the agreement. They are the soldiers crouched behind rubble walls. They are the civilians counting the hours between artillery rounds. They are the medics who still haven't slept. The testimonies emerging from both sides of this conflict tonight are not normal. They are not routine complaints. They are not soldiers venting frustration. They are urgent, specific, and deeply consistent. Soldier after soldier, interviewed separately, described the so-called ceasefire as a fiction imposed from above, a diplomatic maneuver with no connection to their operational orders, and perhaps most importantly, a dangerous illusion, one that made them more vulnerable, not less, because it created confusion about when they were permitted to defend themselves. But a ceasefire only works if both sides believe the other side has stopped. Neither side believes that. In fact, the accounts coming out of frontline positions are among the most candid and alarming we've encountered in this conflict. Here's what we know. Within hours of the official ceasefire announcement, soldiers on at least 3 separate sections of the front line reported incoming fire. These weren't stray rounds or isolated accidents. These were coordinated probing actions, targeted, deliberate movements that forces on both sides conduct when they want to test how committed the other side is to holding their ground. Tonight, field correspondents and independent investigators confirmed that units on the Eastern Corridor continued to engage in direct fire exchanges, including at a position that had recently been reclassified as a ceasefire buffer zone for what officials claimed was a humanitarian observation point. One side acted before the other could consolidate the position. They hit the ridge, they hit the access road, they hit the supply routes that were visibly still active. In other words, both sides targeted the infrastructure of continued conflict, the logistics, the momentum, the operational continuity. This is what makes the official announcement so difficult to take seriously. The ceasefire agreement wasn't just aspirational, it was presented as already operational. It represented the kind of declaration that could shape international opinion and reduce pressure on both governments if left unchallenged, and the soldiers, understanding that fully, continued to fight, not recklessly, not without orders, but according to the last clear set of instructions they received, which had not changed. They didn't receive ceasefire implementation protocols. They didn't receive updated rules of engagement. They received silence from above and incoming fire from ahead. And here's where the story becomes even more troubling. Intelligence analysts and conflict researchers now believe that the ceasefire announcement was designed to test the international community's willingness to accept a symbolic gesture in place of a verified, monitored cessation of hostilities. Both governments wanted to see whether global pressure would ease in exchange for a signed document, and initially it did. The international response didn't demand verification mechanisms. It issued praise that was so immediate, so enthusiastic that even seasoned diplomats raised their eyebrows. You don't usually get that level of celebration before a single round of ammunition has been accounted for. But today, the soldiers on the ground are telling us something important. A military analyst speaking with regional press under conditions of anonymity described the situation as positional ambiguity, a state in which neither side has been formally ordered to stop, but both sides are publicly committed to a peace they have no mechanism to enforce. But the troops proved today that the gap between political reality and military reality remains vast. Their continued operations were not only consistent with pre-ceasefire orders, they were executed so routinely that it's clear no one in the chain of command communicated that the rules had changed. That detail matters because it reveals something important. It shows that the ceasefire was negotiated above the level at which wars are actually fought. It shows that the soldiers are not the audience for the announcement the world is. As reports continued coming in throughout the week, we learned more about the scale of the disconnect between what is being said and what is being done. Units on the northern front carried out standard patrol rotations, forcing continued civilian displacement from villages that should have been accessible by now. Artillery batteries on the southern axis were reported as active as recently as yesterday, maintaining positions that had been designated for drawdown in the last 96 hours since the signing. Drone surveillance teams operating in the contested interior reportedly continued targeting logistics corridors used by opposition forces to resupply forward positions. This wasn't just a delay in implementation. This wasn't just bureaucratic lag. This was a continuation of active military operations. This was a war that got a new name, and a new name is the one thing that changes nothing on the ground, but changes everything in the headlines. For every declaration of peace that has been issued, the frontline situation is countered with something that makes the declaration impossible to sustain. Remember, both sides thought the international community wouldn't look closely. They thought the announcement would be enough. They thought that the word ceasefire carried with it the weight of actual implementation. But tonight, the exact opposite is being demonstrated. The soldiers are still moving. The positions are still active. The casualties, quiet, unreported, undocumented, are still accumulating. What makes this moment so dangerous and so revealing is that the ceasefire announcement came at a time when both governments are under enormous domestic pressure. Hardline factions want total victory and view any pause as surrender. War-weary populations want genuine peace, and we're genuinely hopeful. International partners want to claim credit for diplomatic progress. Military commanders want clear orders they can actually implement. Both leaders are balancing these demands while managing active operations that have not paused in any meaningful way. And when leaders in that position make sudden announcements, they're not doing it from a position of strength. They're doing it because something external forced the gesture. They're doing it from political necessity. They're doing it from the pressure of a moment, not from the will to actually stop. And the soldiers who received no new orders, who were not briefed on implementation timelines, who woke up the morning after the announcement to the same tactical situation they had the night before, they know this. They have always known this. The International Monitoring Body's statement, now circulated to member governments, was designed to signal that the global community is not willing to accept a ceasefire in name only. Officials said plainly that the continued movement of military assets after the signing was inconsistent with a genuine commitment to cessation. That is diplomatic language for, we can see what you're doing, and we are formally noting that it contradicts what you said. You don't usually hear that tone from international bodies unless the gap between declaration and reality has become impossible to paper over. And yet, both governments responded with the language of commitment, the language of sincerity, the language of peace, while their forces maintained their positions. Meanwhile, soldiers from both sides, some speaking directly to independent journalists, others through intermediaries, addressed the situation in terms that no official statement has come close to matching. One soldier said, "We were told there was a ceasefire, then 2 hours later, we were still being shot at. Nobody told us what we were supposed to do with that information." Another said, "The ceasefire is real for the people watching on television. Out here, it doesn't exist." And one veteran of the conflict, who has been at the front for over a year, said, "I've seen 3 ceasefires. They all looked like this. These are not rhetorical flourishes. These are statements from human beings living inside a war that has been cosmetically renamed, from people who understand more than any diplomat ever could just how high the stakes of getting this wrong actually are. Here's what makes the situation even more concerning. The failure of this ceasefire isn't isolated to one front line. Along with the continued exchanges on the eastern and southern corridors, militia-aligned groups operating in the border region also continued activity in areas technically covered by the agreement. Cyber attacks targeting civilian communications, infrastructure continued uninterrupted in the 72 hours after signing. Aerial reconnaissance increased in frequency over several territories designated for demilitarization under the agreement's terms. All of this happened within the same week that the agreement was signed and celebrated. When both sides continue to move multiple operational pieces after a ceasefire, it means one thing: neither side has decided to stop. The agreement describes a world both governments want the international community to believe exists. The intelligence, the journalism, and the testimony of soldiers describe the world that actually exists. Analysts are now considering several possibilities. One is that both governments genuinely want a ceasefire, but lack the internal command structure to implement it rapidly. That this is a failure of execution, not of intention. Another is that one or both governments are using the ceasefire announcement as a strategic maneuver, buying time to reposition forces, resupply exhausted units, and resume operations from a stronger footing. A third possibility, the one that concerns independent observers the most, is that the ceasefire announcement was never intended to stop the fighting at all, that it was a political product designed for international consumption with no operational component whatsoever. And today, the soldiers on the ground took that possibility off the shelf and handed it to the world. They didn't file diplomatic objections. They didn't hold press conferences. They didn't appeal to monitoring bodies. They kept fighting. And in doing so, they told us everything. What we're watching now is a test of institutional credibility. Both governments want to see whether the international community will accept performance over substance. The soldiers want someone to acknowledge the reality they are living. The international monitoring organizations want to prevent a failed ceasefire from becoming a template for future conflicts. And the civilian populations on both sides want to prevent the cost of this diplomatic theater from landing, as it always does, on the people who never had a vote in any of it. Tonight, we've heard from conflict monitors who are now tracking movement on 4 separate sections of the front line. They say the repositioning of forces has actually accelerated since the signing. They say both sides appear to be using the reduction in international scrutiny, the scrutiny that lifted the moment the announcement was made, to improve their tactical positions. And they say the decision to announce the ceasefire without any verification mechanism is likely part of a broader pattern of using peace language as a strategic instrument rather than a genuine commitment. But the soldiers are not being fooled. In fact, if anything, the soldiers are more cynical than they were before. Their reality today, dangerous, unresolved, and invisible to the world watching the celebratory coverage, sent a message to the governments involved that the men and women holding the line cannot be managed with press releases. And it sent a message to the international community that the absence of verification is not neutrality, it is complicity. As this week goes on, we expect more details to emerge about what exactly both governments hope to achieve with an announcement that neither side prepared their forces to implement. But what we do know is that the soldiers' testimony is timely. It pierces the narrative before it fully hardens. It restores the human cost to a story that had briefly become abstract, and it demands accountability from institutions that were already moving on. What happens next will depend on what both governments choose to do in the coming days. If they move toward genuine implementation, real withdrawal, real monitoring, real communication down the chain of command, this moment will be remembered as a rough start that became a real peace. If they continue the current pattern, the soldiers and the civilians and the monitors have already shown the world what is actually happening. They have shown that they are watching, and they have shown that they are willing to say it out loud. And tonight, for the first time since the announcement, the official narrative appears to be under serious pressure. The headlines are quieter, too quiet. And when the headlines go quiet about an active conflict, it usually means one of two things. The situation has genuinely improved, or the situation has become too complicated to fit into a clean story. Tonight, it is the second, because tonight the soldiers reminded us of something we have been told many times in many conflicts across many ceasefires: that wars do not end when politicians say they do, that peace is not a document, it is a condition, and that the people who are asked to lay down their weapons deserve more than an announcement. This story is far from over, but tonight one thing is undeniably clear: the ceasefire exists on paper, the war exists on the ground, and the distance between those two realities is measured, as it always is, in human lives. We will be here watching every detail as the next phase of this conflict, whatever name it is given, continues to unfold.